Welcome to Animals in Very Ancient Art. This week is a choice week, which means that you are required to read one of the three chapters assigned, whether on early African art, Mesopotamia and West Asia, or Egypt through the Old Kingdom. That being said, you are still responsible for material pertinent to the other chapters that we discussed together here during the pre-recorded lecture, or that appears in the additional media posted for this week. We begin here with William. This is our hippopotamus from ancient Egypt, perhaps can be thought of as sort of a mascot for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was made around the second millennium before the Common Era and was discovered in a tomb. So scholars believe that William is what we call a propitiatory art object, meaning that he was intended to serve as some sort of conduit to the gods, whether specifically to appease divine spirits or to sort of satisfy other kinds of spirits, such as the sort of embodiment of the hippopotamus itself. So if we think about ancient Egypt settled on the Nile as it was, we know that hippos are really, really dangerous creatures. And in order to kind of protect Egyptian society from hippos, for example, attacking or lurching up out of the Nile and overthrowing boats and the like, objects like this were created to kind of soothe the hippopotamus energy. And this individual object was actually found with its leg broken, implying that the creator wanted to protect the spirits of the dead that were in that tomb from sort of the rage of the hippopotamus. He is made of what we call faience or faience. And this is a method of earthenware production that includes either quartz or some kind of sand compound mixed with plant ash derived from burning up the plants. And then when this is melted down, the sand itself and the ash will create the sort of glass-like substance. This is a similar process used in stained glass, actually. And when you fire it, it creates this hard sheen of a surface, sort of this glossy surface. And so that's why he is so beautiful, covered with lotuses here. So this is William. These are the areas that we'll be looking at today in the three chapters. We have the Nile Delta here in Egypt. And I want to point out that Lower Egypt is actually north of Upper Egypt, which is south because the Nile runs northward. We have the Fertile Crescent, known as the cradle of civilization. This is an area also known as Mesopotamia, between, as you can see here, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And these are two rather hectic rivers. They flood unpredictably, whereas the Nile is a very standard, regular type of flooding, which means that it's much more conducive to agriculture along its banks. So this is why we often have cultures flourishing around rivers. We also have North Africa with the areas of various artistic discoveries marked here, and then South Africa, same information there. So back about 12,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was not a desert. We're entering a period of warming, and what this does is it brings rain to the Sahara region, which then becomes a grassland, which then supports populations and especially draws populations with its resources. So our first evidence of animals in ancient African art are in what we call petroglyphs. And a petroglyph just means an image on a rock. So there are many reasons why early African art has not survived, which gives us a really incomplete picture of artistic production 8,000 years before the Common Era. Some of the reasons for this are because of modern intervention and economic and political senses, right? Is there war in this region? Are there economic limitations on carrying out proper excavations? Some of it is from human nature and humans generally just behaving badly in the case of looting, which continues to the very present day. And some are environmental, because a lot of the early African art was created on organic materials, including leather, including wood, woven objects, etc. And these tend not to survive. But luckily, these petroglyphs have survived, and we're in Libya and Sudan here. The petroglyphs are created by gouging out these grooves in the rock face. And so these are publicly visible, right? These are above ground compared to the cave paintings that we looked at previously. And the gouges or the grooves would be accomplished using stone tools. But as we can imagine, it's very difficult to carve into straight rock face. So obviously these objects were very important. These depictions were very important because they were clearly time consuming and painstaking. I've chosen two examples here of elephants from your textbook reading. And on the left, we see an elephant that looks quite naturalistic. However, more recently, scholars have argued that there are symbolic elements in this image as well. And so our artists in this period are not just depicting what they see, they're adding their own imagination and interpretation to it. And in this case, particularly, although earlier examples have described this as an elephant doing his business, later interpretations believe this is a symbolic aspect in this image. On the right here, we see an elephant whose trunk is holding up the chains that are holding on to captives, that are restraining captives here. And we can see some nice geometric decoration here in the throw over the elephant's back. So going from just depictions of animals, quote unquote, in nature, right? Even though there are symbolic elements added, those were quite realistic looking elephants. We also see examples of appreciation for the animal form. And I hesitate to say positive, but sort of friendly interactions between humans and animals. On the left here, in Namibia, we have what's called the antelope frieze. And a frieze is a long sort of panel of artistic output. And typically these aren't necessarily meant to be read from left to right or right to left. They're sort of more unmoored, I guess you could say. They're more disconnected from any sort of orderly narrative. And so here we see some antelope, which are delicately drawn with the ochre and the white clay, and then a series of live, nimble figures all around them, especially this one here who seems to be dressed in some kind of special garment, perhaps something sacramental, something ceremonial. And these types of paintings, which happen on rock faces with overhangs typically, which do protect them from the weather, are made by pastoralist people. And the pastoralist people are those who herd. So if we're looking at the domestication of animals in areas like the Fertile Crescent and in Africa, about 10,000 years before the Common Era, we see an increasing relationship with and reliance on these animals. And so this is fundamental to our understanding of how art is changing as a result of environmental and social readjustment and reorganization. In the center, we have an even more stylized image. We have our little ibex here. And this is a ceramic piece made in modern day Iran that is indicative of a style where these artists are actually shaping by hand rather than using the potter's wheel. And this kind of coffee colored pigment, which is applied to the surface of the ceramic, shows us here an ibex, which is a kind of deer-like creature with very, very stylized features, right? His legs are very, very long and thin. His back is arched and his belly is bent up to create this very thin midsection. And his horns are enormous, right? They serve as the identifier for this ibex, who still to this day has these kinds of curved horns, but they're blown up disproportionately and encircling this other kind of spherical motif here in the center. In addition, we see in this upper tier, this upper band, dogs running. And again, very elongated, very stylized, right? With these sort of triangular shaped heads and their little legs in flight, creating the sense of speed and dynamism in this ceramic vessel. On the right, we see some metalwork. This is bronze, and we can tell that it's a copper alloy because it is oxidized green in this very distinctive sort of mint color that we see also today, obviously, with the Statue of Liberty. And what this is a fly whisk. And a fly whisk would be used by an equestrian, someone on horseback, to whip the flies off the flanks of the horse that they're riding. So there would have been some kind of material from this end, probably horsehair, as you know, horses use their own tails as fly whisks. But this would have been carried by an equestrian, and it would have been a symbol of status because not only is it made from a metal, but it is incorporating animal materials as well, right? Such as a horse's tail, that would indicate that there would be excess money available, excess wealth. And we see this individual in an example of hierarchical scale. So the individual is disproportionately large compared to the horse that he's riding. You can see the horse actually to me looks a little more like a bear, but and we can see also within the figure himself that his head is disproportionately large to his body. And so hierarchical scale tells us that the things that are more important in the image are shown as bigger, right? It's not that the artist couldn't create some sort of bodily harmony or some sort of proportion, but rather that there was a choice made here to privilege certain aspects of this art object. We can also see on the individual's face what we call scarification. And this is oftentimes ritual, but it's body mutilation or body modification that provokes the development of scar tissue by slashing the skin in a certain way so that it grows in a particular cultural context with particular cultural meaning. So this is about 6 inches high, would have been held in the hand and carried while somebody was, feasibly on horseback. With regards to slightly less positive interaction, perhaps, we are reminded that the people creating this art hunted, right? There was purposeful herding and husbandry, especially regarding cattle, so that you could use not only the meat from the animals, but also the milk, the leather, the hair, all of these sort of secondary output from animal herding. And on the left here, we see another cave painting that shows us a variety of different sized figures. And what this tells us is that we're actually seeing depictions of children. And this is very, very, very rare for these early objects. And they're shown here doing sort of general aspects of daily life associated with a pastoralist lifestyle. So this includes hunting, this includes sort of corralling the animals and doing all of the other things related to owning and living off of these herds. Nice sort of dappled coats on the animals here on these cattle. On the right, we see an increasingly violent interaction. This is a lion hunt from Mesopotamia. And we see the same figure with his kilt in two separate parts of the stele. So a stele, or a stele, as we sometimes call it in English, is a round, often rounded, flat slab of rock. And in this case, it is made of basalt, which is a volcanic igneous rock, and which gives it its black color. And the stele are often carved, at least on one side, and then propped up vertically in the ground. And these would be sort of a beacon or a message of ceremonial power, of ritual, or even of civic power, reflecting sort of the secular authority of the ruler in the area, or telling us something about the community that lives here. So in this particular case, at the top, we see a spear in the hands of this individual, which is frequently described as a sort of priest king, somebody who's powerful both in the secular and the spiritual realms, fighting a lion. And the lion is depicted here as smaller than the man. And then down here, we have the same figure with a bow and arrow defeating the lion. And it looks like there's actually two of them coming up here. So we have this sort of sense of continuous narrative of events happening one first, then the other. And this story tells us something about the strength and bravery of this priest king, because he's fighting and striving against one of the most fearsome animals in the animal kingdom. We also have an ancient appreciation for animals as they act, right? As in their natural habitat, as just part of the landscape, part of the environment, part of the world known to these individuals. This is an object misnamed sort of ram in a thicket, because it's believed that it's not actually a ram, a male sheep, but rather that it's a type of goat that existed in Mesopotamia. And on the left here, this is actually an image of the discovery of this art object. And you can tell from the center that this is likely a quite fragile object, right? It's covered with gold. It's decorated with lapis lazuli, which is a stone that yields a beautiful ultramarine pigment. This is a very expensive color. It appears, the rock itself appears in natural environments really only in Iran and in Afghanistan. So anytime you're seeing it somewhere else, it's being imported at great cost. On the back of the, I'll call him a goat, but just note that he's called the ram in the thicket. And a thicket is just like a bunch of like branches or small trees. And we can see actually that there's the use of shell to simulate his fleece. When it was found, the fragility of the object itself had been compacted by the weight of the dirt above it. And so it was in desperate need of reconstruction and rehabilitation. The center wooden core around which all of the gold leaf and the other precious objects had been affixed had been disintegrated long by this point. And so this is an attempt at restoring it. The object itself was found in the Great Death Pit in Ur in Mesopotamia. So you can imagine we're going to see a lot of funerary objects, precious objects intended to guide or stay with the souls of the dead in this location. And it's thought that the ram in a thicket was actually part of a pair that may have flanked some other kind of object, like some vessel or bowl. And so we have our comparable goat on the right-hand side here. And this is obviously a picture of a real goat who really prowls around in the thicket for food. So it's believed that this is what this ram in a thicket is modeled on. With regards to different materials, we see here for the first time with the Warka vase coming from Mesopotamia, the use of alabaster. Not that this is the first use of alabaster of all time. This is the first example in this lecture. Just want to introduce a new substance. And alabaster is a form of mineral called, or element called gypsum. And it is typically very, very pale and sort of lustrous in color, as you can see here, and it's soft. So it is quite easy to carve. This particular object is 3 feet high. So this is a real commitment to producing this story as it unfolds. This is an example of using registers. And the registers are these sort of bands that crisscross all around the vessel. And we can read them usually from bottom to top or from one side to the other side. And in this case, we see a mixture of vegetal, animal, and human figures and events. In the very, very bottom register, we see what, and this is a reconstruction drawing, obviously, as if you had slit the back of the cylinder and made it into a flat pane. We see water, we see a river, which is so seminal for Mesopotamian life, right? Surrounded as they are by the Tigris and the Euphrates. The next tier looks to be crops growing, right? And remember that these civilizations are agriculturally sound. They have tamed grain, and they have figured out how to produce crops with surplus, which then they can store in vessels like this. And then here in the third register, we have a series of sheep. We have rams and ewes alternating. And we can tell the rams because they have horns, the ewes because they don't. And they're all walking off towards the right. In the next register, we have individuals who look to be carrying some sort of sacrifice or some sort of gift or donation, probably to a divine entity. And these guys are all going to the left. So you have this visually dynamic interplay between directionalities on the various registers of the Warka vase. At the very top, we see a female figure here in priestly garb. And it's believed that the part that's damaged here, and you can see that the cracks are actually drawn in as well, would have been the patron who commissioned this object. Up there in this upper tier where we can see various sacrifices and gifts, including these little animal figurines that probably held other sacred vessels, or sacred objects rather, they're the vessels. Now, I mentioned before about looting. So in 2003, when the US invaded Baghdad and Baghdad fell, this object was actually stolen from the museum that housed it and went missing for quite some time until it was finally returned under an amnesty but broken into 14 pieces. So this kind of terrible treatment of ancient art, because it's connected to one's heritage or patrimony, a symbol somehow of these places and civilizations of the past, they're still tremendously valuable and meaningful to people today. Oh, so the final thought here is that these animals are in their place in the natural progression of sort of importance in the world, right? We start down here with the world that provides us with food and then provides us with other substances coming from animal husbandry, and then moving up into the people who act as servants to the people who are up in this divine sphere. There is an overwhelming presence of symbols of striving against animals. So we've already seen one example of this, but this is something interestingly that transcends time and place. So we're looking at the span of a difference of a millennium here, and we're going from Mesopotamia to Egypt, or actually vice versa, the Egyptian one was earlier. And we're seeing the same kinds of depictions of heroes, usually stripped to the chest or completely nude, fighting against the most fearsome animals known to these civilizations. On the left here, found in the Royal Cemetery among several other profound treasures, we can, including the ram in a thicket, actually, we can see that this is the front side of a lyre, and a lyre is a stringed instrument. Of course, that part, the back part made of wood, has not survived, nor the strings themselves. But we can see the top is crowned with a bull's head, covered in lapis lazuli and gold, which obviously renders it tremendously precious and tremendously valuable. And in the 4 tiers underneath, in the sort of front of the lyre, we can see at the top an image of a hero striving with 2 creatures who have these long tails. We're not sure if they're mythical creatures, but they look like a representation of the bull shown here. And in the 4 registers, we see examples of animals carrying out ritual tasks that are usually obviously reserved for humans, typically associated with funerary practices. And so this is giving us another interpretation of how the animals function in this kind of mythological or religious interpretation of Mesopotamian culture surrounding death. So the animals are playing an important role, sort of extending out of the real world, I hesitate to say, but the sort of world of the everyday into this more symbolic and mythological world. Here on the right, we have the hilt of a knife, and this is actually carved most likely out of hippopotamus tooth, surprisingly big. And on the hilt of this knife on one side here, you can also see again carved in low relief the striving of some sort of hero against these 2 lions. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but low relief tells us that there's carving, but it's not very 3-dimensional. It's more just barely separating the part that's in relief, that is coming out, from the part that is low. And so we can see that there's going to be very sort of thin, very sort of short height alongside these contours. Does that make sense? As though it's just barely emerging from the substance behind it. High relief, by contrast, a lot of 3-dimensionality. Those objects are going to pop out at you much more intensely. And this idea of striving transcends those 2 particular types of sculpture. They actually also extend into practical objects. And so here we have a hero who himself has somewhat animalistic features, right? If we look here, we see horns and sort of like bull's hooves, but we see again this individual striving against a water buffalo. And in this case, the water buffalo has its head cast back, so you can actually see these very intimidating, huge horns that characterize the water buffalo. And so this object is actually called a cylinder seal. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but this is a sphere, like a little tube with a hole down the middle where you could actually stick something and then roll it, right, using the stick that you put in the middle of the hole. And these would be used in religious, administrative, personal uses to signify authority and to sort of put your seal, literally, onto an object. So these could be used for identifying who has signed off on this particular correspondence or goods that are in transport, or it could symbolize the protected nature of whatever's underneath the seal. And so this is accomplished by taking a seal that is actually carved out of semi-precious stone. In this case, I don't remember which one this is, but it could even include something so precious as lapis lazuli. And the stone is carved in the negative, right? So you're actually gouging out the part that will then pop up when you roll the seal over wet clay. And then when the wet clay hardens, it sets the depiction of what's all around the seal as you roll it sort of ad infinitum. And in this case, we have two different images of the striving. And just look at the detail, how you have to think in the negative to produce something like this with such exquisite precision and such delicate elements, such as the hair and the beard. And then also in the center, we have this little hilltop with a tree that looks like it has fruit being born on it. But this would be something that would be very, very small and handheld and used, and yet nevertheless reflects the same iconography that we're seeing on the more monumental images of striving. Moving off of this idea of the hybrid animal that we just saw, the individual, the hero that had some sort of animalistic features, going back to Algeria and the paintings, we see an image of a female figure with a very, very round head. And this is the round head style. And these figures do not have faces. So it's unclear exactly what kind of message is being expressed here. But we also see, curiously, that the female figure has enormous horns like the water buffalo we just met. The dots on her skin, and so we can tell her breast is here, the dots on her skin probably refer to some sort of textile that is being evoked by this artist using these beautiful hues of ochre with the white clay and the deep, deep sort of blood red. In the center here, we have a low relief carving of a jackal-headed man, and we can see here the eye and the ears, and then the snout, which kind of curves backwards with the teeth quite visible here. This fearsome creature. A jackal is a kind of wild dog, a predator. But again, we have these human elements. We have sort of rings around the elbows and then this wide belt, and yet we have a sort of tail extending from his posterior. And then finally, we have another hybrid, which is not a human-animal hybrid, but rather a hybrid of two animals. And this is called the serpopard. The word serpopard is serpent and leopard joined as one in a portmanteau word. And we can see that we have this sort of wildcat body, like a leopard, that culminates in a very sinuous snake's neck, which is often depicted interlocking with another snake's neck, and then topped again with the head of what looks like a leper with those big ears and that kind of big feline nose and jaw with a little bit of his beard there. So we can see two animals being blended together. And again, this is a seal. You can see the hole better here. So you would put some sort of rod through here, and then you could just roll the seal right on down that wet clay. And these modern reconstructions show us how it would have looked. And then again, we have some sort of birds of prey here in between. But there's something so elegant and exquisite about the repetition of this pattern forever, right? Using this particular shape of object to replicate art. Animals also served in a militaristic purpose. And this is the royal standard of Ur that was found also at the royal cemeteries. And this is one of the two sides of it. This is the battle side. The other side shows feasting and sort of propitiatory gifts to the emperor, etc. It's called a standard because when it was discovered in the 20s and early 30s, the archaeologists who discovered it thought that it would have been mounted on a pole and kind of raised aloft in battle for people to follow to identify their leader. That being said, it's kind of like a trapezoidal wooden box shape with a larger base than its top. And it's unclear whether that would have been something that could have been mounted or would have been mounted on a pole and carried anywhere, because clearly this is made of many, many different fragile objects as well. So it resides today in the British Museum, and that should send off some bells for you there. But it's made of wood, and it is sort of mosaicked with pieces of lapis lazuli, as you can see the blue, which gives us this extremely rich, pure color, with limestone, which then can be pigmented, and bitumen, which is a kind of tar-like substance, almost like our asphalt in a way, that can be used as a sort of sticky glue. In this, we see 3 registers. Each one is divided with these little geometric shapes, most of which have survived. We have a little bit of loss here. In the very bottom register, we see the animals, which are onagers, and these are a kind of wild donkey, serving the military, right? The Mesopotamian military. So we actually see them not using horses, right, but using wild donkeys as the chariot poles. So we can see these wheeled chariots with the individuals and all of their weapons ready to go, their spears over the shoulder, etc. And the onagers are pulling the chariots forward and trampling over, I should point out, the nude bodies of their enemies. And here we have an onager sort of bucking in flight as he's leaping forward with the chariot. And so these animals would have been integral to the successful military campaigns carried out by various Mesopotamian rulers. In the top, we have another example of hierarchy of scale or hierarchical scale. This is the individual who is the most important in this register, and we can actually see that his head breaks through the top tier of border. And again, some more onagers here with their, you can actually see the wood coming through the patterns in the wood surface on the body. So thinking about these animals as being absolutely crucial to all kinds of aspects of life in the ancient world. We move now to the Narmer palette. And I'm sure all of you art students are familiar with what a palette is. This looks a little different than our kind of like bean-shaped painting palette with your thumb going through it, right? But this palette would have been used to mix compounds that would often serve cosmetic purposes. However, because of its size, about 2 feet high, and its extremely heavy weight, it's less likely that this palette would have been used in any kind of day-to-day service, but rather that it was probably a divine offering. And so here in the middle of the 2 necks of the serpopards, which we see again here with their leopard-like heads and bodies, curly tails mimicking the shape of their neck, and then these long curly Q necks with, you know, the ability to interweave with each other and create this very pleasing shape. We see the place where this would actually have served as a palette, and we're mixing something like malachite, which is green, or coal, which is black, to use in cosmetics. And the coal was actually used, just like our baseball players today, under the eyes in order to dissipate the sun's glare in these desert climates. And so this Egyptian piece is named after King Narmer, who is semi-legendary. And he is known, based on this iconography, for being the one who reunites Lower Egypt with Upper Egypt, creating one consistent whole. So here on the right-hand side, we'll start with this upper register here. We see him actually wearing what's called the red crown of Lower Egypt. And we know that this is the red crown because of the shape of it, with this little squiggle coming off the forehead area. And again, we're seeing hierarchy of scale. He, Narmer, is larger than all the other figures here. We see some sort of page boys or some sort of other processors who are carrying on poles, right? So they would be visible far and wide, these various animal figures, including an animal skin, 2 little birds here and a dog, and an animal skin with the tail still attached. In the right tier, we see the decapitated enemies of Narmer. And actually, their heads are below, but also so are their castrated genitalia, rendering these enemies not only physically vanquished, but rendered completely impotent. At the top, we see frontally faced images of the cow goddess, Bat, who is presiding over these scenes and clearly supporting Narmer. And again, we have the 2 water buffalo style horns here. At the bottom, we have another ram or water buffalo stomping on not only a person, but sort of invading what looks to be a cityscape viewed from the top with its walled fortifications. So again, the complete destruction is being translated through the animal actions. On the right, we see Narmer, enormous by comparison, right? Wearing the white hat, the white crown, sorry, of Upper Egypt, which has been likened to the shape of a bowling pin. And again, we have Bat here. And Narmer is holding his enemy sort of by the hair and about to strike. So this is a true symbol of power. We know, however, that it is sanctified power because of the presence here of the Egyptian god Horus, who is depicted here as this bird. So Horus is overlooking the activity and the successes and the victories of Narmer. And so the animals serving as these sort of divine protectors, particularly of the Egyptians, we see plenty of this, not only in sculpture, but also in papyrus, hieroglyphic-based images. And here on the left, we have Khafre, who is one of the kings in the Old Kingdom, and very, very noble facial profile here, really embodying that gravitas or that sense of personal power associated with proper rule. But again, behind, we see Horus, who is, a falcon, I said bird before, but with his little beak, actually embracing with his wings the back of the pharaoh's head. And so we definitely get the sense that there is, through this image of animals, that there is divine protection of and divine support of this ruler. On the right, we see animals in probably their most organic sense in Egyptian art. And this is as the divine hybrids, where we have humanoid bodies, but the heads of different animals. And so in this case, in the papyrus of Ani, Ani is a scribe who works for the royal court, and he has died. And so he's descending to enter the world of the dead. And this is actually a page that's compiled in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And he's going through this particular ritual, followed by his wife here, of having his value appraised by Anubis, which is the dog-headed god. Palindrome. And so this ritual weighs the human heart of the person who's died, all being overseen by Anubis, with the feather of Ma'at. And Ma'at is an Egyptian concept of sort of harmony and balance in the universe. And it's the pharaoh's responsibility to uphold Ma'at in the world that he's ruling over. And we can see all of the hieroglyphic pictograms all around this scene and various other gods here. Finally, probably the most famous example of the hybrid in the Egyptian culture is the Sphinx. And the Sphinx is unique in this particular case compared to the other giant stone monuments that we've looked at, such as Stonehenge, because the Sphinx is actually carved directly out of the bedrock. So inextricable from this place, right? It cannot be moved. Whereas if we look at Stonehenge, we see, and especially in the blue center circle, we see the importation of those megaliths over tremendous distances, in this case, 250 miles coming from Wales, if you remember from the last lecture. So what's different about the Sphinx is that it's actually in situ. It is carved from what it is sitting on. And the Sphinx guards Khafre's tomb and temples. So we actually have a whole funerary complex, which the Sphinx is sort of lording over. And the Sphinx has the head of a male wearing the Neres headdress, which identifies him and associates him with the pharaoh himself, and associates the pharaoh, therefore, with the Sphinx, and both of them with the divine. And the arms outstretched of a lion at rest, and the body of a lion. And we can actually see sort of the haunches here, the tail curling around, and then these are the arms that are bent at the elbow and resting. So we have this lion sort of in repose, stoically and eternally guarding over this sacred area. Here are a few of the terms that you should know from the chapters. I think the only one that we didn't discuss, two that we didn't discuss, polychrome means multicolored. So anytime you're seeing, for example, cave paintings with the red ochre and the white clay and the yellow ochre, these are polychrome. And cuneiform, which is the first non-pictogram written language coming out of Mesopotamia, somewhere around 3000 before the Common Era, right at the time that cities are developing and huge temple complexes are developing at Uruk and Nippur and places like that. And cuneiform is written by trimming a reed, so this little straw, and using it to create wedge-shaped etchings in clay, which can then be fired and hardened and preserved forever. So we have a great example of this in the textbook, but it is something that you can just Google if you want to see some pictures of it. It's quite a complicated looking language, but this is our first written language. And it's important because it loops into the production of art as we're seeing these civilizations settle in one place, build up these monumental cities, and then ultimately need new forms of writing and new forms of art to express their power. Okay, so you should know these for the quiz, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.